Because while the synagogue remained part of the Jewish believers' cultural practice until they were no longer welcome, and both Jews and Gentiles would sometimes hear the good news proclaimed there for the very first time, for the called forth in Jerusalem, from shortly after Yeshua's resurrection and ascension, they continued daily with one mind in the temple and breaking bread from house to house. Acts chapter 2, verse 46. This is where the called forth originally and primarily met, not in the synagogue or in church buildings, but in each other's homes. In Acts chapter 8, for example, this is where we find the called forth during the massive persecution of the believers by Paul, Shaul, in Jerusalem. In verse 3, it says that Shaul was ravaging the called forth, entering into every house and dragging off both men and women, giving them up to prison. In 1 Corinthians 16:19, Paul wrote to them saying that Aquila and Prisca, along with the called forth in their house, also greet you much in the Master. And again in Colossians 4:15, greet those brothers in Laodicea and also Nymphas and the called forth in her house. And again in Philemon 1:1 and 2, to Philemon, our beloved and fellow worker, and Apphia, our sister, and Archippus, our fellow soldier, and the called forth in your house. This was the biblical norm and pattern for the generation of the called forth who spread the message of Yeshua throughout the world. They existed and gathered not in large auditoriums. Rather, their groups were small enough to fit inside a home. Now understand, they weren't meeting in houses because there were only a few of them, and just until they could raise enough money for a building fund. They also weren't meeting there just to avoid public scrutiny, because they were meeting in homes when there were already tens of thousands just of Jewish believers, not to mention all the disciples that were being made among the nations for at least a couple of decades. And even Paul says in Acts 20:20 that he taught both publicly and house to house. So they met in homes because at the local level, this was where they were the called forth. This was where they met, not for worship services, but to build up one another, and where unbelievers would come in and hear the message of Yeshua and be saved. Only gradually over time, after the recorded history of Scripture, did the believers move away from homes and begin to meet in converted houses and build larger buildings. And while they were in the homes, in groups of manageable size, the believers could live out that face-to-face interactive ministry to one another and the building up of the body for the common good. Where the called forth was designed to gather was house to house. This is why today, even in the largest of churches, they still strive to maintain a small group, home-based ministry. Because deep down and from the Word, they know that it's in homes where believers truly grow and grow together. Today, church or congregational life revolves around the weekly service, while small home groups are considered optional and supplementary. The problem is, that's backwards. Most believers don't realize it's supposed to be the other way around. Now, don't misunderstand me. There's no problem with large groups of believers coming together for communal praise, worship, and teaching. We see this modeled in the Scriptures too. But going to a church building every week isn't like going to the temple. There's nothing uniquely holy about a church building or synagogue. It's not the Lord's house, and it's not specially inhabited by God. Of course, modern innovations would eventually make it possible to facilitate larger and larger gatherings of believers, citywide gatherings. But that was never a reason to dump the biblical model of gathering in homes as the central, natural, everyday place for the building of the body, thinking it was somehow insufficient and unnecessary for the proper functioning of the called forth. And I believe this is a major reason why we see such a weak body of Messiah today. We got away from the ordinary in pursuit of the extraordinary. We replaced the organic with the man-made. We institutionalized the called forth, and we called it church.